'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Mike D coming down for sure.
In this next video, we're going to have a bit of a look at the fundamental duties of directors, and I think in this video we'll concentrate on the fiduciary duties. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, you can classify the duties that directors owe into three different kinds. Well, that's the way I classify them. Other people would disagree. But I'd say there's three fundamental things you've got to do as a director. Number one is you've got your fiduciary duties, or the duties against self-dealing. You're acting for someone else, so you've got to act on their behalf, not your own. Okay, important, probably the foundational duty of a director and officer. The second duty is to act with due care and diligence. Now, that's something that's changed over time, but it essentially means you've got to apply yourself to the task. And the third kind of duty, everything else. Okay, that's not quite fair, but the reason I would classify everything else as those two duties, fiduciary and due care and diligence, apply to everyone who's a director and officer. The specifics of your company will mean different pieces of legislation have more application or even no application at all to your company. So it's very difficult to say with absolute certainty this is what will apply to you into the future, right? There's an element where you have to analyse your own position when you become a senior manager and or director and understand those other duties that might apply to you. So why don't we have a look at what's going on around this, particularly this fiduciary duty. So as we've already said, a director is an agent of the company. So really that means that they share those fundamental duties of an agent that we covered in Module 9. But because the principal is this legal entity rather than a natural person, and because of the impact companies have had on society, it means we've developed these ideas for directors and officers much more than what we have in the traditional agency area. We've done that through the development of law around the Corporations Act. That's the main piece of legislation that regulates directors and officers, something we discussed in Module 11. So the first set of duties or set of requirements for directors, officers and employees, we can term and group them together and term them as kind of fiduciary duties. Now, look at this. Look at what I put here, that it's not just directors, it's officers and employees. And I'll come to why I'm saying that, but people who work for the company, because in a sense, all these people are agents of the company. Okay. Now, there are some requirements that are just for directors, some that are for directors and officers, but what we're going to talk about applies to everyone who works at a company. I'm going to mainly talk as though it's applying to directors, but you can also think that if you work at a company, these kinds of requirements apply to you, these fiduciary duties. So fiduciary duties arise when you're acting for someone, not yourself. Very clearly, that's the case for a company. If it helps, you can think of other relationships where this is the case. So a parent acting for a child, right? They should be acting in the best interests of the child, not themselves. A doctor acting for their patient, right? The doctor should be acting in the best interests of the patient, not themselves. A solicitor and a client, any kind of professional and their client where you're giving advice. So these all give rise to this idea that we've got to be acting for the other person, not ourselves. And if you get that key concept, then the rest of the specifics of these duties should make a little bit more sense more easily. In terms of the Corporations Act, there are 4 core expressions of this duty to act for the other, not yourself. Okay. The first one is Section 181. And it says that a director, officer or other employee, but a director needs to act in good faith for a proper purpose. A director needs to avoid conflicts of interest, something we'll come to, is probably a good way to think about that, is to manage conflicts of interest. Section 182, a director shouldn't misuse the position. and you shouldn't misuse information. Okay, so they're the four things. Act in good faith for a proper purpose, avoid conflicts of interest, don't misuse the position, don't misuse information. So let's look at this first one, to act in good faith. So you can very easily find yourself faced with decisions where the act you take might be against the interests of the company. And sometimes we can even make it seem as though what we want to do is acting in the interests of the person that we're working for, right? So think about this. You're a bartender and you give free drinks to your friends, okay? Now, I think you inherently know that that's wrong, right? That's the company's drinks or the employer's drinks, not yours. But you could justify that, right? You could use some form of justification by saying you're trying to build the reputation of the bar, right? Well, yeah, but you're really not likely to be acting in good faith. You're giving drinks out because they're your friends, not because there's any form of agreed promotion that you're enacting. Further, you're not really acting with a proper purpose, right? The purpose of giving drinks away is to promote the bar, not make your friends feel good or make you feel good by helping your friends. Now, to some degree, there's a difference between honesty and this good faith, proper purpose, right? You can honestly believe something is the right thing to do, but you still might not be doing it for a proper purpose, right? The proper purpose in a bar of handing drinks over is so that the bar will make profit. That is the purpose of a for-profit bar, to make money. If you hand drinks over for a different reason, that's not a proper purpose, even if you think it's the right thing to do. So I really want to stress that. Acting honestly is subtly different from acting for a proper purpose. Most of the time there's going to be a large overlap, but not all the time. And that's what this extract from a judgment is saying here, right? This section, the section embodies a concept that's similar to constructive fraud. We won't go into that. But it says it does not involve moral turpitude or knowing that you're doing the wrong thing. I have no doubt that a director who exercises his powers for a purpose, which the general law deems to be improper, so not the proper purpose, infringes this provision, notwithstanding that according to his own lights, he may be acting honestly. So even if you think you're acting honestly, you may not be acting for a proper purpose, okay? So there's two elements to acting in good faith, right? It is kind of acting honestly plus, and really importantly, plus for a proper purpose, whatever the purpose of the company actually is. It's both of those things because you're acting for the company, not yourself. So it's not what you think a proper purpose is, it's what the proper purpose of the company actually is. And most of our companies, the proper purpose is making money. So perhaps the most talked about area of directors' duties involves this issue of conflicts of interest. So remember that example from the bar? The bartender has a conflict of interest, right? They want to look after their friends, but that's in conflict with their role as an employee of the bar, which is to make as much money as possible for the bar, which is what they're being employed to do. So we have this conflict between their interests and the bar's interest. I think a classic case around conflicts of interest to help us think about it, particularly in the role of a decision maker like a director, is Blakey and the Aberdeen Railway Company. So Mr. Blakey happened to be a director of two companies, the Aberdeen Railway Company and Blakey Brothers. Mr. Blakey was a director of Blakey Brothers, and that company made railway sleepers. You know, the things that they use to, the wooden bits that they make the railway lines out of, right? Guess where the Aberdeen Railway Company bought their railway sleepers? You're right, from Blakey Brothers, right? So now you have Mr. Blakey, who's on the board of both the Aberdeen Railway Company and Blakey Brothers. And the judge says, in essence, dude, how can you possibly get the highest possible price for these railway sleepers, which is your duty as a director of Blakey Brothers, while also getting the lowest possible price, which is your duty as a director of the Aberdeen Railway Company? Right? You can't. Right? That's impossible. You have a conflict of interest here. Right? So conflict of interest is about this, opposing interests, and it warps the decision making. Right? It warps the decision making. In actual fact, Aberdeen Railway Companies is probably a better example of conflict of duties, right? A conflict of duties and a conflict of interest, but it makes the point very well, I think. And so the whole idea of conflict of interest is not allowing the mind of the company or the decision making of the company to be biased by the interests of the decision maker. That we've got to make the best decision for the company and in an unbiased way. And the law has a number of ways that we can try and manage this situation. I mean, fair enough, one way is to avoid it. And sometimes the conflict might be so bad, as in Aberdeen Railway Company, that you have to avoid it, that you shouldn't take part in that decision. But there are other ways that we can manage it as well. So why don't we get into this idea of conflict of interest? So we've already come across this idea about conflict of interest when we were talking about agency law, and that's what we'd expect, right? Because this is an example of the agency relationship. One of the most interesting things about conflict of interest is that it's not only entering engagements where someone has a conflict of interest, but it's where they can have a personal interest or which possibly may conflict, okay? Oh, this becomes difficult, right? Now we're moving from where you definitively have a conflict to where you may have, or even some people would say, a perceived conflict of interest. We need to think about what we're going to do in those situations. So we're doing this in order to make sure that the fairness or unfairness of a contract is without question. Okay, we want to make this unbiased decision. The reality of the world is it's almost impossible to totally avoid conflicts of interest. For instance, you work in retail or hospitality, at some point you're going to have to deal with family and friends. You're going to have a conflict of interest. So the key is not total avoidance. The key in business is managing conflicts of interest, with this idea that your interest shouldn't warp or bias the decision of the company. So it's about making sure that that interest doesn't get in the way of doing the right thing. And the main way the law tries to do that is to make sure that the person with a conflicting interest lets the other decision makers know that they may have one. So you let someone with authority counteract any bias you may have. So let's say you're serving your friends at a coffee shop, you want to give them a free coffee. You might go ask the owner if that's okay, right? If they say yes, you've managed your conflict interest. It wasn't your decision, it was the owner's, right? Someone who's independent of the conflicted parties. So that's an example of how you can manage a conflict of interest. Another way is you clearly just don't give them a free coffee. You subvert your interest, right? That's another way of managing that conflict of interest. But you're really trying not to bias the decision. Now, in the Corporations Act, we have some specific legal requirements for when we have a conflict of interest. And they differ depending upon whether you're a small company, a proprietary limited company, or a large company. In a small company, right, this is our PTY Ltd, directors have to disclose their interests when they're first aware of them at the first board meeting, but the director can still be there and even vote on it. Okay? So really it's just making the other decision makers aware that you have this interest. And in a small company, the view of the law is that's enough. In an LTD, a company that's larger that can get money from the public, right? In a public company, directors still have to disclose that they have this interest, which is the same, right? So disclosure is central to managing conflicts of interest, but they can't vote. They can't even be there when the matter is discussed unless the other directors who don't have an interest allow them and say they should be able to take part. Okay? So, director is out of the decision making unless the others say it's okay. Unless the other directors say it's okay. Okay, here, under a PTY Ltd, the director is in for the decision making if they want to. Now, that might be a little bit difficult to understand, but here are a couple of concepts for you to think about. The first one is that the nature of the decision-making in a company is that it's a group-based decision-making. The directors make the decision, not any director. So realistically, the director who is conflicted around an issue only has one vote, right? And if the others know that they're self-interested, then there's probably, hopefully, no way that that one vote can influence all the others to vote a certain way, right? They're going to say, no, you're interested, and they would vote against them. Okay, so that's the idea going on here about why you need to give notice of what your conflict of interest is, so the other directors can take that into account. Now, in a PTY Ltd, the presumption of the law is that the kind of directors know one another more, the shareholding is more tightly held, the impact on society is lower, so we really let people kind of work it out a bit more for themselves. We're not as strict for those reasons. However, once we become a public company where we involve probably more dispersed shareholderships and more separation of ownership from control, then the law starts to say, hang on, we want to make sure all of you directors don't get too influenced by this one director with a conflict. So that director has to leave the room and the others have a discussion about whether they should participate. So it's an added security measure to try and remove bias from that decision process for those kind of companies. Wow, okay. So far in fiduciary duties, we've done act in good faith for a proper purpose, and we've done conflict of interest. We have two more that are very similar, right? Use of position and use of information. The structure is roughly the same. Okay, so we got this idea that we're working for the company, not ourselves, and that when we're in the position of director, we've got to use that position for the benefit of the company. When we're in the position of a director, we've got to use the information that we get for the company. It's the company's information, not ours, right? And these provisions are structured the same way. So what do they actually say? So if you actually look at the provision, section 182, which we have over here, a director, secretary, other officer, or employee, right? So it's not just directors. Look at this. It's anyone really in a company. Must not improperly use their position to gain advantage for themselves. Okay, so we've got this. Clearly, you can't self-deal. Or someone else, right? So you can't use your position to help a family member or even someone who you've just met, right? You just can't use your position to help someone else. That's an improper use of your position. Or to cause detriment to the corporation because you're there to make decisions for the corporation, not to cause detriment, okay? So that's what the provision says. When you've got the position of director, you can't misuse it to gain advantage for yourself or someone else or cause detriment to the corporation. And over here we have an example from a famous Australian case, ASIC and Adler from the early 2000s, the HIH-FAI insurance debacle that occurred around the turn of the century, where it was found that Mr. Adler was trying to keep the price up of HIH. He was buying shares to try and keep the price up, but he was doing that to benefit his own holdings rather than the company. See that? He was trying to keep the price of the shares up. But the court found he wasn't doing that for the benefit of HIH. He was doing it for his own benefit. And because of that, it was a misuse of his position. He was misusing his position to try and keep the share price up to benefit himself, not the company, even though it could have looked like he was doing both at the same time. So the final one is a replication of this use of position for information, right? A person who obtains information because they're a director, officer, employee must not improperly use that information to gain advantage for themselves, someone else, or cause detriment. So the basic idea to grab a hold of here is that the information that you get when you're working for someone else, that information belongs to them, not you. Thus, for directors, officers and employees, the information you gain in your position should only be used to benefit the company. You can't use it to benefit yourself. One of the main times that can become a problem is if a shareholding group or a shareholder has put you on a board and they want to know what's going on, right? Because technically, actually legally, you can't tell them, right? The information about what you're getting in the boardroom needs to be kept confidential, and it's the company's information, not that shareholder's, and so we shouldn't be taking the information out. It's the same when you're an employee, right? If you learn some information about a business opportunity as part of your role in a company, you got to tell the company about that business opportunity. You can't go and exploit it, right? You got to use that information for the company. Now, fair enough if the company says no, they don't want to pursue it, it's a little more open, right, about what you can do then. But again, it's not clear cut. The information that you get when you're working for a company is the company's, not yours. And you can't use it to gain an advantage for yourself, anyone else, or to badmouth the company. And this is one reason why whistleblowing is so hard, right? Because the information you get when you're in a company, you can't use it to cause detriment to the corporation. We do have specific whistleblowing legislation to try and overcome that problem, but you can see part of the tension when you see things going wrong in a company when we actually have this provision. So there you have it, fiduciary duty. It's all about acting for the company, not yourself. 4 key expressions of that duty are that we have for a company under Corporations Act: acting in good faith for a proper purpose, avoiding conflicts of interest, not misusing your position, and not misusing information. The next duty that we're going to deal with has a different tact, the duty of due care and diligence, and that's in the next video.